there are people out there listening and able to hear me. Welcome to L'Abri Fellowship. My name is Ben Kais, and I'll be speaking tonight. There's a few more lectures left in L'Abri's fall lecture schedule. Next week, Joshua Chestnut, same time, same place. His title is On Being Politically Homeless. A very relevant topic for our time, obviously. Thank you for joining us. Just so you know, there are people in this room. There are real people. Say hello, everybody. We have some students in the house this term, and we're really enjoying that, and feel privileged to have people actually here in the room. For those of you who are out there, welcome. And it's just strange to be talking into a computer screen, but good. We're glad for the technology. Thank you to Dave, who's been helping us out. So tonight, my title is Making and Fixing in a World of Cheap Replaceable Objects. And as I always say, as a sort of disclaimer, we choose our titles long before we finish writing our lectures. And so we very often have to kind of play fast and loose with our lectures and try to make them roughly resemble the title that we sent out. But this one is pretty close, I think. I'm going to start just with a very quick anecdote. A number of years ago, I was traveling with some friends. We're in a music group together, and we were in North Carolina, and we decided to do a house show at the house of some friends of ours. They had a couple of young kids, and it was a chaotic day. We showed up late in the afternoon. There were multiple people coming and going. Dinner was being made. Things were getting set up for the house concert. Guests were coming into town. And meanwhile, the husband, our friend, was in the basement the whole time working on his furnace that had shut down. There was no heat or no hot water or something. And he was in and out with like muddy boots and kind of like all throughout the whole afternoon. And I could tell that I don't know, I've been married long enough to know that there was probably some tension in the house as a result of this, although they were very graceful. And by the end of the evening, when we were about to start our show, he fixed it, and it was up and running. And I just realized how it just felt really unusual to witness somebody working on their own furnace and then like finishing it, having it up and running. And there was a certain tenacity that my friend had that I don't see in many people. So we're in a season of just having looked at the news for the past few weeks. Obviously, COVID is continuing, wildfires, hurricanes, and a hotly contested election. Who in the world knows what will happen come November 4th. It's understandable that many of us kind of teeter towards a sort of apocalyptic mindset. I'm guilty of that myself. You start to ask questions like, how well would I cope if there was no one to help me with a plumbing problem or a leak in the roof? What if there was nowhere to buy clothes? What if when a tool broke, I would have to fix it or go without? Or if I needed a chair, what if it was up to me to make it? How would I fare if society and the economy basically collapsed? Pretty badly in most areas, I would think. And while I know these kinds of meditations on the apocalypse are often alarmist and melodramatic and unproductive, for me, these kinds of questions don't go away. So wouldn't it just be good, even in non-apocalyptic circumstances, to know how to do something practical around my house? To rely on the skill of my own hands to actually meet my material needs and the needs of those around me. To cultivate a garden and grow it well. To prep and cook a meal from scratch. To diagnose and repair a problem with my car or with my mower or something like that. To build a new bookcase. To maybe make a dress for my daughter or something like that. I know many people who can do these things and much more difficult things. So these may sound not so much like huge achievements to you, but if that's the case, it's because you're in the minority. As a whole, people in our culture have become less able to do things like this than they were, say, 50 years ago. And this is a crisis of what Matthew Crawford calls decline in manual competence. Manual competence. And there are two questions I want to explore tonight. To what extent is the decline in manual competence really a problem? And then secondly, what might a Christian understanding of human beings bring to the conversation? And so, presumably this will work. Yes, it's good. Amazing. This is my outline. So I'm going to start off really, you'll soon discover this lecture is basically a glorified book report on Matthew Crawford's book. And so the first section I just call a book recommendation. I'll just talk a little bit about this book, Shop Class's Soulcraft. Second section I'll talk just a little bit, not even a timeline, or it's not at all a comprehensive history of manual labor or anything. It's just a couple vignettes. And then thirdly, dealing with this question, is this really a problem, or is this just the way of the modern world? Is this what we should expect? And then lastly, a reflection on making, fixing, and human thriving, what that means. Well, first of all, a book recommendation. So this is Matthew Crawford. He wrote the book Shop Class as Soulcraft back in 2009. He's an interesting guy. He studied philosophy, worked for a number of years at a DC think tank. I don't even really know what that means, but it sounds very impressive. He's also worked as an electrician as a young man and has owned his own motorcycle shop. So the book Shop Class as Soulcraft is kind of a unique combination of social history, history of work, philosophy, and autobiography, sort of drawing on his own experiences as a motorcycle mechanic. He's written several books since. I'm ashamed I have not read them yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I think his latest book has something to do with car maintenance. So I'm just going to refer to this as Shop Class because it's easier than saying the full title. In Shop Class, he explores some of the historical reasons why manual competence has declined in our culture and what the implications are for our relationship to work and to leisure. And among many other things, he points to the advent of the assembly line in car manufacturing. This was something that Henry Ford invented and was first put into practice in the Ford Motor Company. In Matthew Crawford's words, the assembly line systematically separated thinking from doing. And I'm sure there's examples of ways in which thinking and doing in the workplace had been separated before, but this was a real watershed moment in the history of work, manual work. And it introduced the separation of thinking and doing as the key to efficient mass production in other industries too. So assembly lines, obviously now there's assembly lines for your phone probably, or your vacuum cleaner, or everything. It's not just automobiles. But this idea of separating thinking from doing was seen as the key. It's sort of the key innovation in making mass production efficient. So, in other words, Ford mechanics who used to oversee the building of an entire automobile and had a holistic understanding of how all the parts fit together and work together were now expected to perform one repetitive task on the line over and over and over and over. So the planning and the oversight of the finished product was a matter of upper management. The upper management would think through that and think of a scheme and plan out what the car would do and how it would work and everything like that. The people on the floor on the assembly line weren't expected or allowed even to engage with the automobile on that level. So, in the name of efficiency, the mechanics were suddenly not expected to engage cognitively in their work. Hence the separation of thinking and doing. Evidently, when the assembly line was first introduced, most of the mechanics walked out because they were aware and they felt rightly that their work had been seriously degraded, right? So Ford's, this is one example. There's many, many things that contributed to where we are today, but Ford's innovation played a part in a broader disparagement of the manual trades that came later. And so Matthew Crawford points to that, among many other things. Manual work increasingly was viewed as being both mindless and unsatisfying, and increasingly it was mindless and unsatisfying. Clearly not suitable work for young, bright people to consider. Crawford notes that one of the consequences of this is that in the last 20 years, shop class has been cut from school curriculums all over the country. It used to be an ordinary part of public education, having shop class, whether it's a wood shop or metalworking or any kind of shop that's teaching young people to make things with their hands. It seems to be one of the things that's first to get cut when there's budget problems and whatever. Schools do not seem to consider it necessary or beneficial for students to learn manual skills. They want to be preparing students for quote-unquote better work, more mentally oriented work. I'll say more about this later. So this is, you'll notice I quote this book quite a lot at length. One of the reasons is he's very good writer. I find him to be a very, very good writer and a joy to read. So just don't feel you have to actually read all the words on the screen. There's going to be a lot of them. Just if you want to sit back and just soak in them, that's fine too. Anyway, Crawford writes this. Today in our schools, the manual trades are given little honor. The egalitarian worry that has always attended tracking students into college prep and vocational ed is overlaid with another, the fear that acquiring a specific skill set means that one's life is determined. In college, by contrast, many students don't learn anything of particular application. College is the ticket to an open future. Craftsmanship entails learning to do one thing really well, while the ideal of the new economy is to be able to learn new things, celebrating potential rather than achievement. Somehow, every worker in the cutting-edge workplace is now... good. Yep. Just give a holler if I forget to do that again. Somehow, every worker in the cutting-edge workplace is now supposed to act like the intrapreneur, that is, to be actively involved in the continuous redefinition of his own job. Shop class presents an image of stasis that runs directly counter to what Sennett, he's quoting another guy, Sennett identifies as, quote, a key element in the new economy's idealized self, the capacity to surrender, to give up possession of an established reality. This stance toward established reality, which can only be described as psychedelic, is best not indulged around a table saw. And yet, Crawford points out, it is simply not the case that manual work is static, mentally unchallenging, and unsatisfying. There are assumptions being made that he says are based on really false ideas. So in his jobs as an electrician and as a motorcycle mechanic, he's found work to be, and I'll just list a couple things that explain what he talks about these a lot throughout the book, cognitively rich, and at times very mentally demanding. And this is not because he is stupid, obviously. It's because a lot of manual work is cognitively demanding. To diagnose and to fix an ailing motorcycle engine required him to draw on a wealth of knowledge and experience. He had to learn to really, really observe what was in front of him, to use all his senses, to listen, to smell, to touch, to see, and attend to every detail, to draw inferences, to form theories and test them, to even diagnose what's wrong with a car or a motorcycle, even before you come up with a solution for the problem. And so it's actually quite rich cognitively. Ironically, he says he sometimes felt like he did less thinking when he worked for the think tank in D.C. He also found his manual work to be psychologically satisfying because it dealt with tangible realities that everybody could see, including himself. So his success or failure at a job could be immediately recognized. There's something closer to an objective standard of excellence than he experienced in other jobs, where your sort of performance is, evaluations of your performance is really amorphous, So the motorcycle either runs or it doesn't, and immediately you know whether you've succeeded or not. And this gave him a deep sense of pleasure and accomplishment. He also talks about other satisfactions connected with the social currency, connected with being a good motorcycle mechanic. And you run into like one of your customers at the bar, and he's like, "Yeah, he's the guy that fixed my bike. And, you know, it's nice to go out with your wife and be recognized by everyone at the bar. It's awesome, right? So there's a community aspect to his competence that was really, I think he experienced as really beautiful and good. And then the small detail that working in manual trades, very often you're working in industries that are not easily outsourced. It's actually, you know, to be a plumber today is, whether, you know, not everybody is made to be a plumber, but it is job security. Always will have work, always, and you can charge a lot of money for it too. And so the whole idea that this association of manual labor with sort of low-wage, blue-collar work is just doesn't really bear out in reality. You know that if you try to call a plumber, and any plumber you call, they usually give you about a week before they can show up. It's because there's not a lot of good plumbers in this world. We have personal experience with this just the last week, so it's been this is pretty close to home for some of us in this room. So even as consumers, even as people that buy things and have things, Crawford says there's something deeply human and therefore deeply fulfilling about having agency in the world of physical things, to be masters of one's own stuff, he said. When we do this, we're getting a handle on the real world outside our heads, which to him has real moral significance. So the other side of that coin is that there's something sad and degrading about being alienated from your own stuff and not understanding the first thing about all the things you have and depend on. Essentially ignorant as to how it all works and therefore helpless when it stops working. There's something, obviously some of that is inevitable in the world today. Not all of us can understand how our cell phone, maybe very few of us understand how our cell phones work. But that as an overall theme in our lives is not maybe a good thing to embrace. Another quote from Crawford. This is very small, sorry. He's in this passage. He's comparing the narcissist versus the repairman. The moral significance of work that grapples with material things may lie in the simple fact that such things lie outside the self. A washing machine, for example, surely exists to serve our needs, but in contending with one that is broken, you have to ask what it needs. At such a moment, technology is no longer a means by which our mastery of the world is extended, but an affront to our usual self-absorption. Constantly seeking self-affirmation, the narcissist views everything as an extension of his will, and therefore has only a tenuous grasp on the world of objects as something independent. He is prone to magical thinking and delusions of omnipotence. A repairman, on the other hand, puts himself in the service of others and fixes the things that they depend on. His relationship to objects enacts a more solid sort of command, based on real understanding. For this reason, his work also chastens the easy fantasy of mastery that permeates modern culture. The repairman has to begin each job by getting outside his own head and noticing things. For this very reason, the repairman's presence may make the narcissist uncomfortable. The problem isn't so much that he's dirty or uncouth. Rather, he seems to pose a challenge to our self-understanding that is somehow fundamental. We're not as free and independent as we thought. So he's basically saying that as we depend on all of the gadgets and objects of life that we don't understand, it's very easy to become, to develop magical thinking. You know, there's all this stuff just works for me. I don't understand how it works. It just does. And that enables us to develop, in a sense, a narcissistic attitude towards, basically everything around me is an extension of my will when it works, right? But then suddenly, when something breaks, and I have no idea what to do, I have to call on somebody else who actually really understands something about the physical world that I do not. And that throws me into a tailspin because it makes me realize, oh my gosh, I'm actually just dependent. I'm not really omnipotent, like my gadgets sometimes make me feel, right? So I find that very perceptive, and I like, So because he's a philosopher, Matthew Crawford keeps on sort of bumping up against the question of human meaning and purpose, which I consider to be a theological question. What do people need to thrive, And what does that indicate about what people are for? How are people supposed to interact with the world around them? These are questions that he, like I said, bumps up against. And I want to applaud really most of the things that he says in this book. I highly recommend this book. I agree that working with your hands and achieving a level of competence is more important than we often think today. But I want to connect some of his ideas with a foundation that he seems to lack, and that is a Christian theology of engaging with the physical world. And we'll see how that works. I'm going to do just reflect on a couple. This is the second section now, and I want to just reflect on a couple books, works of literature that give you a little vision into how things have changed, how things might have been like in certain contexts before, and how things are now. And the first one, I'm not actually going to read any quotes specifically, but I'm just going to kind of describe some of the themes of the book Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And so she was the author of the series of the Little House books, Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie, which sort of chronicle her life as a child traveling west with her family and basically pioneers in a covered wagon, and all of the joys and challenges that came with that. This story, Farmer Boy, is the story of her husband's upbringing before they met. And he grew up in upstate New York. Most of the story takes place around 1865, 1866, in that ballpark. And I just want to mention three things that come across really powerfully in this story, and I'll try to think, if I think of specific illustrations, I'll mention them. But three themes that are really interesting in this story and appealing and yet unusual today. So first thing is the incredible competence and resourcefulness of his father and mother. Very, divided into fairly traditional roles, male and female roles, and yet both of them super competent and busy all day long, doing things that are putting to use an accumulated knowledge and experience of years and years and years. And so between the two of them, they can really do almost everything that needs to be done on this large farm. And so Laura Ingalls Wilder describes in wonderful detail many of the things that need to be done, and that Almanzo, who's the boy, who's the main character in the story, he's witnessing these things and trying to learn these things by watching his father all the time. And so this is wonderful. There's things that you do on the farm when you can't do anything else, but oh yeah, this is something that we can do because you're always busy. And he was sitting on a shaving horse, cutting shingles with a draw knife, and Almanzo would sit on his lap and they'd do it together, But a lost art. Obviously, not many people cut shingles with a draw knife on a shaving horse anymore. But it's just part of the kind of wealth of experience and knowledge that someone would have to have who was running a big farm like that in 1866. Secondly, Almanzo's unquenchable desire for more responsibility and mastery. He really, 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 really wants more responsibility. He really wants to be entrusted with more and more and more new skills. He wants to be entrusted with more demanding tasks. Ultimately, he longs to show his father that he's ready to own a cult and to break a cult himself. But he starts with growing a pumpkin, and then raising a suckling pig, and then eventually a team of oxen that he has to train to respond to his commands so they can pull his sled. He has to figure out how to untangle them when they get stuck in a huge snowdrift, dragging a sled covered in huge logs. Only at the end of the story is Almanzo entrusted with a young horse, after a lot of learning. But all the while, he's learning how to survive and prosper in that world, in that time. So that's his kind of this unbelievable desire for more responsibility. Let's say that's something. It displays a kind of grit and perseverance and tenacity that is rare among young people today. I would say, and I'm not just being critical of young people, but it's rare in myself. Thirdly, the father has what today would be considered a callous willingness to let his son fail and figure out problems for himself. So he's the opposite of a modern helicopter parent. If you think of a helicopter parent who sort of hovers over their child, is so eager to protect them from failure that the end result is that the kid grows up to be totally unprepared for the real world, right? Unable to deal with any real difficulties because they've always been sort of cushioned from reality, you know. And so the father is sort of the opposite of this. He's not callous. He's not negligent at all. He's watching his son very, very carefully, but he knows the best way that Almanzo is going to learn what he has to learn is to figure it out, right? He wants Almanzo's kind of sphere of agency to expand, just as Almanzo does, actually. So even though the Industrial Revolution was already well underway, Farmer Boy describes a world which in some ways predates the Industrial Revolution. This is farm life. This isn't city life. It's a world where ordinary people are expected to perform highly skilled tasks, which demand both their full mental engagement as well as very skilled hands. It's not an easy world at all. There's an amazing passage where there's a frost at night, and everybody gets out of bed, and they have to go pour water on all of the young corn plants. Otherwise, when the sun comes up, they're all going to be decimated. So you have to get up in the middle of the night in the freezing cold. Otherwise, you may lose your entire crop for the season. So it's not easy. It's not romanticized. At least I don't think so very much. It paints a pretty rough picture of what life would be like. But it's also a world in which work was really meaningful and in some ways fulfilling, and the desire to work and take on responsibilities was a good and normal thing. You know, young people should want to take on more responsibilities. So there wasn't any such thing as like emerging adults back then. He was already acting like an adult by the time he was 12 and able to do a lot of things that I'll never learn how to do. Secondly, I'm just going to read a passage out of East of Eden, which is kind of a strange passage to read. There's many, many more profound passages to read out of East of Eden, but this one stuck out to me as I was thinking about this lecture. Adam Trask is the main character in Steinbeck's novel. And I thought Steinbeck looks a little bit like John Krasinski in that picture. Is that true? Is that just me?
Just you.
I think he looks great. Anyway. It's just me. So Adam Trask has purchased a new car. He's a wealthy landowning farmer, but he knows nothing about cars. Nobody really did at that point. And it's been delivered to his farm by his friend, who's the car dealer, Will Hamilton. But in order for Adam to learn how to start and operate and maintain his new Ford, a mechanic has to come and spend the entire following day at the farm, tutoring him on how this thing works. And so this is around the turn of the 20th century, maybe just before the outbreak of World War I. So this is near the turn of the 20th century. And I'll just read a section here. And this is Steinbeck just kind of reflecting on cars. It is hard now to imagine the difficulty of learning to start, drive, and maintain an automobile. Not only was the whole process complicated, but one had to start from scratch. Today's children breathe in the theory, habits, and idiosyncrasies of the internal combustion engine in their cradles. But then you started with the blank belief that it would not run at all. And sometimes you were right. Also, to start the engine of a modern car, you do just two things: turn a key and touch the starter. Everything else is automatic. The process used to be more complicated. It required not only a good memory, a strong arm, an angelic temper, and a blind hope, but also a certain amount of practice of magic, so that a man about to turn the crank of a Model T might be seen to spit on the ground and whisper a spell. Will Hamilton explained the car and went back and explained it again. His customers were wide-eyed, interested as terriers, cooperative, and did not interrupt. But as he began for the third time, Will saw that he was getting no place. So this is the next day after he's failed to explain the automobile to Adam Trask. And this is the smart aleck young engineer, mechanic, who's come out to teach them a thing or two about this car. First of all, he scolds at him for not having done his homework and reading this huge manual. He hasn't done his reading on the car yet, right? So this is the mechanic. He moved to the front of the car. Now, this here is the crank. And see this little wire sticking out of the radiator? That's the choke. Now watch carefully while I'll show you. You grab the crank like this and push till she catches. See how my thumb is turned down? If I grabbed her the other way with my thumb around her and she was to kick, why, she'd knock my thumb off. Got that? He didn't look up, but he knew they were nodding. Now, he said, look careful. I push in and bring her up until I got compression. And then, why, I pull out this wire, and I bring her around carefully to suck in gas. You hear that sucking sound? That's choke. But don't pull her too much or you'll flood her. Now, I'll let go of the wire and give her a hell of a spin. And as soon as she catches, I'll run around and advance the spark and retard the gas and reach over and throw the switch quick over to magneto. That's where it says mag. And there you are. His listeners were limp. After all this, they had just got the engine started. The boy kept at them. I want you to say after me, so you learn it. Spark up, gas down. They repeated in chorus. Spark up, gas down. Switch to bat. Switch to bat. Crank to compression, thumb down. Crank to compression, thumb down. Easy over, choke out. Anyway, on and on and on. Switch to mag. Switch to mag. Now we'll go over her again. Just call me Joe. Anyway, he's just intentionally trying to show the complexity of what it was, both the automobile itself, which is way more complicated to get started and to operate, but also, like he said, the blank slate that the human mind was when it came to automobiles. You don't even know what you're dealing with. It's this complete mysterious novelty, right? With nothing to compare it to, all this complexity and hassle, I think, must have been considered just normal. It's just part of the necessary work of owning an automobile. These things were crazy, mysterious, wagons that could go by themselves. They required real expertise. So in pre-World War I America, to take advantage of whatever convenience a car would bring, it was understood that you would take on a significant weight of responsibility. In a sense, you have to become a mechanic to operate a car. In the first paragraph I read, though, Steinbeck says some things that might have been true back in 1951 when he wrote the novel, but are not true now. He says, today's children breathe in the theory, habits, and idiosyncrasies of the internal combustion engine in their cradles. And also, to start the engine of a modern car, you do just two things, turn a key and touch the starter. This might have been true in 1951, but in 2020, you need to do even less to start a car. It'd be hard to find a car that had a starter button anymore, right? You basically just have to have your foot on the brake and turn the key, and magic, right? Everything is automatic. Also, the majority of the mechanical marvels that allow a car to run are automatic and completely hidden from our view, right? If you look at these old cars, you see all the mechanics kind of hanging out. I mean, there's a hood, but it's very exposed. Mm-hmm. You can look at it very easily, and if you know what you're doing, you can recognize where every part is. But things today are hidden from view. The internal workings of things are hidden from us. And as a result, we don't really need to understand them as long as they're working. They're out of sight and out of mind. So children today, I don't think grow up so much with a knowledge of the internal combustion engine that they've just sort of absorbed from their culture at all. I think they grow up with the belief that cars simply work, unless they don't. It's an attitude that goes something like this. I push the pedal and it goes, and my car operates as it should and allows me to get where I want to go, so that I never have to really think about the internal workings of it. It might as well actually be a magic carpet for all I know about it, right? Until it breaks, and then it's not a magic carpet anymore. Matthew Crawford begins his book with a series of observations about how many modern appliances hide the inner workings, which is very similar to what I've just been talking about. He says this, another long quote from Matthew Crawford. This creeping concealedness takes various forms, The fasteners holding small appliances together often require esoteric screwdrivers not commonly available. It's very true. Apparently to prevent the curious or the angry from interrogating their innards. By way of contrast, older readers will recall that until recent decades, Sears catalogs included blown-up parts diagrams and conceptual schematics for all appliances and many other mechanical goods. It was simply taken for granted that such information would be demanded by the consumer. A decline in tool use would seem to betoken a shift in our relationship to our own stuff, more passive and more dependent. And indeed, there are few occasions for the kind of spiritedness that is called forth when we take things in hand for ourselves, whether to fix them or to make them. And I think of my friend who was working on his furnace all day. That spiritedness is a really good word for what he was doing. Only a truly spirited person would have bothered to do that. What ordinary people once made, they buy. And what they once fixed for themselves, they replace entirely, or hire an expert to repair, whose expert fix often involves replacing an entire system because some minute component has failed. And this last observation really rang true for me. We had a Sears repairman come out to look at our gas range stove and had to replace this massive big control panel on the top because some tiny bit of it had failed. But of course that tiny bit was impossible to replace by itself, and so we had to replace the whole thing, most of which wasn't even broken. And that's just normal. That's just what happens. There's no other way to fix the stove. So, many such products today are designed to discourage curious investigation and to encourage magical thinking. And you can see the reason why is because there's always someone ready to sell you a new one. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to just buy a new one if what you have to go through to fix it is so ridiculous. And this has, Matthew Crawford saying this over many, many years, has produced a kind of passivity in us towards the things we use. And I'm sure you can think of many examples as well that are similar to this. But I want to move on now and engage with the question: is there really a problem here, or is there not a problem here? And I think I just wanted to voice some of the objections to this idea that it's a real loss when manual competence declines. Is it a real loss? What's the problem? And my first objection here, sort of playing devil's advocate a bit, goes like this. So, widespread manual competence is basically an obsolete thing of the past. Let's just be honest. To argue for the return of shop class, so to speak, is to be nostalgic and sentimental. There's no major loss to lament here. People ask questions like, do contemporary Americans really need to know how to do anything? Hasn't the global economy, prevalence of digital technology made most manual skills basically unnecessary? And isn't that good? If we can afford to pay other people to do all the things for us, why wouldn't we? If we can buy something cheap made in China and when it breaks buy another one, why wouldn't we? Behind many of these attitudes is the sense that handmade objects or the practice of repairing your own broken objects is just romanticism. We live in a time where people no longer need to know these primitive skills, and we should be learning how to live in the world that really exists, where work is much more flexible and undefined and usually tech-driven. So that's the objection. Of course, I think there's some truth and merit to this objection. It is true that most contemporary Americans, with a bit of money, can get away with producing very little with their hands. Again, you can buy very cheap things and replace them instantly. It's possible to get by in life with very little engagement with physical stuff around us at all, particularly the more engaged with digital gadgets we are. So the loss of manual competence is not costing anybody their life, in an affluent country anyway. This may not be the case at all in other places, by the way. In some places in the world, to be manually competent is a matter of life and death, and certainly sometimes in history. but to the average sort of suburban American, it's manual competence, and the lack of manual competence isn't a life-threatening situation. And we have to acknowledge that there actually is a real danger in romanticizing the past. For example, we should be thankful for the ways in which some newer technologies really do free us up. So you don't have to think about all the things we might have had to before. For instance, you don't need a mechanical engineering degree to drive your car, and I'm thankful for that myself. After reading the passage in East of Eden, I'm really glad that I don't have to go through all of that to maybe not even start the car. So romanticism is often not a helpful way to think. Convenience and the other things it frees us up to do is really a valuable thing. I think we have to acknowledge that. But often with convenience, as you know, comes blissful ignorance. It may be blissful, but it's also ignorance. And every once in a while we see the cost of that ignorance. So in addition, I want to say that the accusation of romanticism is sometimes a totally bogus one. So this is me pushing back a little bit against the argument I just voiced a minute ago. It's a quote from Nicholas Carr, who's written a number of really interesting books. One book a number of years ago called The Shallows, which is talking about the impact of internet use on how we think in our minds. And that was years ago. I think many of the things he wrote in that book have been proven to be even more true than he knew. This is from a different book called The Glass Cage. And he says this: we assume that anyone who rejects a new tool in favor of an older one is guilty of nostalgia, of making choices sentimentally rather than rationally. But the real sentimental fallacy is the assumption that a new thing is always better suited to our purposes and intentions than an old thing. That's the view of a child, naive and pliable. What makes one tool superior to another has nothing to do with how new it is. What matters is how it enlarges us or diminishes us, how it shapes our experiences of nature and culture and one another. I think this is really, really a helpful point. He's basically saying that the assumption that the newer technology is automatically the more relevant and useful it will be to us is just as naive as the nostalgia for typewriters. Just a different kind of naivete, right? It's based on the same sort of sentimentality, actually, but instead of being misty-eyed for the way things used to be, it's being misty-eyed about humanity's inevitable progress into the future. You can be misty-eyed about both, right? So there's no rational reason to assume that every new technology will be better for us than what came before. Just like there's no rational reason why societies will inevitably progress towards perfection. Progress is a huge matter of faith for a lot of people, and it's actually a deeply sentimental idea because it denies the reality we see around us all the time. Well, what evidence do we have that humankind is moving towards some utopian reality? Zero. But many people like to believe that. So it's possible, even likely, given what I believe as a Christian, that people are finite and sinful, deeply broken. It's even likely that society will seriously stray away from truth and goodness. Regression, rather than progress, has been known to happen in the past, right? New is not synonymous with good, and we can say that about all kinds of things, but in this case we're talking about new technologies. So a second objection to the main sort of argument I'm making here. Again, I'm saying that the loss of manual competence is a problem. And then there's people that say, no, it's not. Get over it. And so this is another sort of objection to my main point. So it goes like this. Let's not be naive about the differences between people. People have very, very different gifts and tendencies. Some have an aptitude for manual tasks and sort of a practical coordination so that making and fixing things comes naturally to them. Other people neither have the ability nor the desire to work with their hands. So it's kind of foolish to claim that there's this innate human longing to engage with the physical world, to make, to fix, etc. Some people should simply not be trusted with working on their cars. And again, there's some real merit to this claim as well. My grandparents, I'll give a little personal anecdote here. My grandparents would make an interesting case study along these lines. So my maternal grandmother was always self-conscious about not being book smart. She always considered herself uneducated and to some degree. But she was extremely manually competent. And not just in stereotypically feminine ways. She had a workshop where she made and fixed furniture all the time. She showed me how to splice 2 pieces of rope together when I was a kid to use on her sailboat. She was always working on fixing things on her sailboat. It was a total mystery to me how that works, to splice rope together. So I didn't come away with any great knowledge, but it was very impressive. She seemed to be able to learn how to repair most things if she put her mind to it. And she could knit and sew and do all those things as well. My grandfather was more of a typically brainy person. His knowledge of history and geography was amazing. He could rattle off anything. He could answer almost any question you would throw at him about history and geography and those kinds of things. He flew bomber planes in World War II and later became an airline pilot for the rest of his working career. So obviously a very, very capable person. But when it came to manual competence around the house, he could hardly do anything. He could hardly make his oatmeal in the morning without breaking something. And you'd hear him, you'd hear him crashing around, and it was just hilarious. He was not coordinated with his hands, not to be trusted in that way. And so there was room in their household for each to sort of go with their giftings. Thankfully, this is wonderful and wise. My grandmother was clearly the fixer. My grandfather was not. He balanced the checkbook, but it would not have been a good thing. It would be a naive thing to expect him to mess with the car, even in minor ways. My point is that it was a good thing that my grandmother was a fixer, because her manual competence was a huge asset to her home and to her family. She probably saved them lots of money over the years, both by repairing things and by making every Christmas and birthday present for years and years. But even that aside, even the money that was saved aside, she was good at it, and it gave her a sense of satisfaction as she served others with that gift. But she never saw her manual gifts as a sign of her intelligence or as being as valuable as book knowledge. So this was sad in a way. She didn't view that as intelligence. It was just, oh, I can do some things. And so she continued to be self-conscious about herself in a lot of ways, although she was obviously deeply intelligent in her ability to do all those things so well. Not everyone has the same inclination to work with their hands, that's true, or the same abilities. But when people are inclined in that way, it's important to bless it and not condescend to it as being somehow some lower form of work or some lower gift, right? Not to especially when young people who are sort of setting out in the world and trying to think about their vocation, what they're going to do for work, we do people a real disservice if we just somehow, whether directly or by implication, imply that that work with your hands is somehow lower or less prestigious, important, less likely to influence the world. Whatever. People are so different from each other, have so many different kinds of gifts. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, but there's absolutely no biblical foundation for saying that to work with your hands is somehow lower or less important. So, I maintain that loss of manual competence is a loss. And one of the reasons I want to say that is that, in part, it's a consequence of the dominance of digital technology in our lives. It started much earlier, and there's trends that started much earlier than the advent of computers and the internet, but the dominance of digital technology has accelerated the loss of manual competence in lots of ways. Because we increasingly live and breathe in sort of virtual spaces, virtual digital spaces. The time we spend there is one of the biggest obstacles to engaging the physical world with our hands. Now, L'Abri, forgive me for those of you who actually were there whenever it was, we watched the documentary The Social Dilemma. We watched, most of the people interviewed in this film, it's about social media and some of the destructive things that are going on because of our use of social media. Most of the people interviewed in the film were from within the tech industry, or they used to be in the tech industry, and so they were people with very high-level jobs in Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Reddit, Pinterest. I don't even know what some of those things are, but I know, I've heard of Facebook, definitely. The contributors spoke with one voice about the sinister effects of social media in our lives, and many of them have children and confessed they wouldn't let their kids come near it, even though they had designed a lot of the algorithms that control this stuff. And they described in detail how the tech companies use extremely sophisticated knowledge of our psychological vulnerabilities to get us addicted to our devices. And this is why so many people are literally unable to be separated from their phones. Human loneliness, human vanity, the desire to be seen and known, and the fear that you'll never be seen and known, a deep desire for approval. All these human tendencies are strategically exploited, and even you could say ruthlessly exploited by tech companies. There was a guy who was there who sounded very proud of the fact that he engineered the like button on Facebook, this idea that you can like somebody else's post. And he was like, well, the whole idea was that we would just sort of spread joy and affirmation. But after a little while, it became clear that the like button was responsible for more depression and anxiety in people than anything else Facebook had ever done. It's because everybody who posts something is suddenly tormented by how many likes they've received, or tormented that they haven't received enough likes. And oh my gosh, just chaos and anxiety all over the like button. Really, really fascinating. You can see how it gets at these very deep insecurities that most people have, right? And exploits them. So lots of studies have shown that the notifications on your phone, when your phone beeps when you get a text or an email, and like I said, the number of likes you receive after you post something, they are addictive in a similar way to hard drugs and alcohol, to the extent that they produce a dopamine rush in your brain, in the pleasure centers of your brain, which is the same thing that substances will often do, and becomes the sort of the foundation for addictions. Very similar thing going on with our digital devices. And obviously our undivided attention is very valuable to Facebook, Instagram, etc. You do not pay for your Facebook account because Facebook gets paid by advertisers who use their platform to access as much of your attention as they possibly can. And that's one of the main themes of the documentary and of several books that have been written in the last 10 years. These attention merchants. The more of your attention or time Facebook can claim, the more they get paid by the advertisers. And so naturally Facebook and other social media platforms are in the business of co-opting as much of your attention as they can. And getting you addicted is really the best way to do that. One of the quotes that stood out to me, I mean, I'm not a tech-savvy person at all, so this might have been well known to everybody in the world except me, but it was poignant to me. Within the tech industry, people say, if you use a product that you do not pay for, then you are the product. If you use a product that you do not pay for, then you are the product. Our attention is being sold by social media to advertisers. So this is not news to anyone that's read about this topic at all. There's nothing new about this. But one of the things I noticed about The Social Dilemma, this documentary that we watched, was that there was a pretty despairing tone throughout the entire film. Sort of the assumption of this is just inevitable. What can we possibly do? It's hopeless. The amount of data being mined and collected about each of us is so vast and comprehensive, it makes these tech companies virtually omniscient in terms of their knowledge of us and their ability to predict what we do, and maybe omnipotent in their ability to not just predict, but to tell you what you're going to do, to form your desires and habits. We don't really stand a chance. So we're under constant surveillance, and our opinions and our choices are being fed to us There's no breaking free from this. It's just too big of a problem. Oh well. Now, this kind of pessimism, it may be realism, I suppose, when we think about the widespread nature of it all and how, the sheer numbers of people who are sort of connected all the time to their devices. Maybe we should be pessimistic. I don't know. But when it comes down to our choices as individuals, despair, I think, is completely inappropriate. I found that coming away from the film. We're not actually trapped in a world in which big tech industries always know where we are and what we're thinking and what we're about to do. The reality is that we're only being surveilled to the degree that we choose to use social media. No one in the documentary mentioned the very low-tech solution of habitually going for walks and leaving your phone at home. Very low-tech solution. Giving yourself several hours a week of blessed, unsurveilled freedom, in which you're not being manipulated into buying anything, and you're not constantly having to check on what other people think about you, and nobody knows where you are if you leave your phone at home. If you have your phone on in your pocket, someone can know where you are at all. But so why focus on social media in this particular lecture? I think there's hope that manual work could actually become part of the remedy if we allow it to be. It's not the solution, obviously. It's very complicated, but in the way that our kind of addiction to the virtual, streamlined, magical world of digital technology has kind of contributed to the decline of manual competence. Mm-hmm. I think to try to really work at growing in manual competence can help us gain freedom. It can work the other way around, gain freedom from our dependence on digital technology. And what I mean is this: so when you set out to make something, say, not even something terribly ambitious, but say it's your first carpentry project and you want to make some wooden bookshelves. Even though it's not the most complicated project, it does demand a high level of sustained and undivided attention. That is, if we really throw ourselves into it wholeheartedly and we want to avoid losing fingers. It takes attention, undivided and sustained attention. So if I'm sawing a board or hammering a nail, sustained, undivided attention is simply required. You can't really do anything else at the same time. I really can't be doing anything else. The activity must, by its very nature, exclude other activities. And so this kind of exclusive nature of most manual work is what can make it deeply restful, actually, particularly if we're not used to doing it. I don't want to be naive. If somebody, is a landscaper all day long, you're worn out by the end of the day. But for those of us who don't often work with our hands, the act of working with our hands and doing something like this, building your shelves, can be deeply restful because it forces us to essentially unitask rather than multitask. It quiets our minds. It can. I find this strangely, not that this is really manual competence, but when I mow the lawn, it's actually deeply restful for me because it's one of the things that needs to be done. You can't rush it, and for some reason, mentally I can't really do anything else except just mow the lawn. I don't know whether it's the vibrations of the machine or something. When I first started mowing lawns, I thought, I can plan my next, prayer meeting thoughts, or I can write a letter in my head, or I can even pray while I mow the lawn. Nope, I can't do anything. Nothing works except mowing the lawn when I'm mowing the lawn. And at first that was frustrating, and then I kind of realized, this is really great. I'm just going to mow the lawn, and I'm going to try to do a good job at it. And it may take me a couple hours, and then at the end of it, first of all, you have something nice to look at. There's an immediate result of your work. It doesn't last long, but it's there. And I find that I feel sort of mentally rested because I've been doing something that hasn't allowed me to think about a million other things or do anything else. I don't know if that's everybody's experience. It's certainly my experience. Back to the bookshelves. So because of there's some mental challenges inherent in it, learning how to do it, learning how to measure and to cut and everything, and there's certainly a lot of satisfaction in working with the wood and producing something that's useful. I think it's one of the best ways to cheat the attention merchants of our attention and to kind of wrench it back towards something real and healthy and productive. Because the attention we give to making something in the real world is attention that we're not giving to advertisers through our Facebook and Instagram use. We resist being controlled when we choose to make things intentionally. You may say, and this is my, I thought of this, so I'm going to sort of cut off the objection before you make it, that in order to build a bookshelf, I'll probably have to watch a couple dozen YouTube videos, right? Shoot, it's true. Probably I will watch some YouTube videos whenever I need to make something I've never made before. But even then, the technology is not calling the shots or dictating what I should be doing. I already have a purpose that I'm setting out to do. The technology is helping me to achieve that. And as long as I can be self-controlled and not do a YouTube deep dive, go down a wormhole watching a string of videos, as long as I can avoid doing that, then YouTube as a technology is helping me to do something external to itself, which I'm determining, not the technology. Andy Crouch wrote this really thoughtful book called The Tech-Wise Family. It's a very short, very practical book. It's good. It's not just for people who have families and kids and they're trying to negotiate the whole use of technology in that context. It's for anybody. Actually, it's really wise. But one of the things he talks about in his family is one of the things he criticizes about our digital gadgets is it produces in us an expectation of easy everywhere. Basically, every bit of information, everything I need should be accessible everywhere I go easily. And that's just the expectation that having a smartphone builds in us. And for this reason, he really demands in his household that digital technology does not take root in the center of the house, what he describes as the hearth, what would have been the hearth, the center of activity of the house. The hearth, he doesn't really have a hearth, but that's just, metaphorically, the center of the family in the house is a place for challenging and creative projects to happen and space to interact with each other around those challenging and creative projects, where your children will actually learn courage and tenacity and all these things that we want to encourage our children to learn. So that's I recommend that book. Anyway, I want to move on to my last section, making and fixing and human thriving. It has to be said that in recent years, attitudes towards manual competence have been changing. There's lots and lots of people who have seen this as a problem and actually really want to engage physically and make things themselves. The DIY kind of wave of interest over the last number of years is great, and it's sort of it's kind of a cool thing to be able to make something yourself. This was true even before COVID. One of my good friends came over with a loaf of sourdough that she made, and she wanted to make sure that I knew that she was into this before COVID. Anyway, I thought that was really funny. So many people have gotten into sourdough bread only since COVID, and those are just the newcomers, whatever. In his book, The Revenge of Analog, David Sachs says a lot of interesting things. Each chapter is kind of looking at I'll just explain what he means by analog is any aspect of life that is not digital. Basically, anything that engages with real physical things. And this book is kind of about a resurgence of interest in real physical things, and he talks a lot in the beginning about vinyl records, as they used to be totally dead and factories shut down, and with the advent of CDs, tapes first, CDs, and then digital music on your phone or on your iPod, and then in recent years there's been such a resurgence in the interest in vinyl among young people that all these factories producing vinyl records have opened up again, and new factories have been built, and it's just sort of taken off. Anyway, that's an example of analog. So something that resists the pull of digital technology. he says this. This is David Sachs. Nope. Maybe I just didn't put it up there. Never mind. I'll just read it. Listen closely. For increasing numbers of people around the world, in nearly every place where digital life has acquired a real and lasting presence, analog is now a conscious choice, requiring greater cost, both materially and in terms of our time and mental capacity, than the digital default. And yet people increasingly elect it. Why? One reason is pleasure. Analog gives us the joy of creating and possessing real, tangible things in realms where physical objects and experiences are fading. These pleasures range from the serendipity of getting a roll of film back from the developer, to the fun of playing a new board game with friends, to the luxurious sound of unfolding the Sunday newspaper, and the instant reward that comes from seeing your thoughts scratched onto a sheet of paper with the push of a pen. These are priceless experiences for the people who enjoy them. And then he goes on to argue that there's actually a profitable market for analog things because of this perennial appeal of tangible objects to people. They'll never just be replaced forever by digital products. So he's arguing that the fascination with the more primitive tools, primitive entertainment and activities is more than just a trend that will settle down and pass away. Even if demand for one thing collapses, our culture will never completely abandon analog. So Sachs is talking mostly about what we choose to buy as consumers. Film cameras, turntables, vinyl, paper newspapers, all because of the pleasure we find in touching and seeing and hearing real things. But I think this pleasure is perhaps even more satisfying when we make or fix something ourselves. So it's not just about what we choose to consume, it's about what we produce with our hands, things that did not exist before we engaged with the world. Matthew Crawford actually says something interesting at this point. He says, the satisfactions of manifesting oneself concretely in the world through manual competence have been known to make a man quiet and easy. They seem to relieve him of the felt need to offer chattering interpretations of himself to vindicate his worth. He can simply point. The building stands, the car now runs, the lights are on. Boasting is what a boy does because he has no real effect in the world. But the tradesman must reckon with the infallible judgment of reality, where one's failures or shortcomings cannot be interpreted away. His well-founded pride is far from the gratuitous self-esteem that educators would impart to students as though by magic. And then he goes on, he's reflecting on the pleasure he experiences when he used to be an electrician, when he would finish a job, turn on the lights, and let's see if I have this here. Yeah. I never ceased to take pleasure in the moment at the end of a job when I would flip on the switch and there was a light. It was an experience of agency and competence. The effects of my work were visible to all to see, so my competence was real for others as well. So what are David Sachs and Matthew Crawford onto here? There's something more going on than just, a hipster obsession with vinyl, or the satisfaction of an enthusiastic electrician clicking. There's something more than just those particulars. I think Crawford's obvious reference to Genesis 1 here is really telling. When an electrician has correctly wired a house and the lights come on, the sense of accomplishment and effectiveness in the world is in a sense akin to God saying, "Let there be light." This is because the Bible teaches us that we were made in the image of God, who is the supreme maker and has supreme agency. But the dominion of people is completely limited, with nothing like the dominion that God has, obviously. But it's nonetheless a picture in miniature of the creative power of God himself. And that's part of what being an image bearer of God means. So Matthew Crawford is describing the pleasure of exercising his God-given dominion in the world. The reality that with hard work and engagement and attention, you can actually affect the world around you for the better. He does not really explore why this might be. He describes what he calls the poignant longing for responsibility and the desire to feel the world is intelligible. But he does not venture to guess where it comes from. From whence the satisfaction from engaging with physical stuff? From whence comes the hunger to produce something tangible with our hands, whether it's something new or it's something old that we've fixed and made serviceable again. Matthew Crawford is observing, I think very perceptively, the signs of the image of God, and specifically the desire for a true expression of dominion. I think of him as he's describing the longing of a steward to steward things. That's what the longing of a steward to steward things. His diagnosis of the problems in the state of work today also, I think, ring true with a Christian belief in dominion. Because we were made to exercise dominion. People never thrive when it's taken away. This is something that we talk about a lot at L'Abri. Dominion is such a built-in capacity in human beings. This ability that men and women both have to engage the world around them, to have a vision for something different and to affect the world around them, whether it's in any, not just physically with their hands, but dominion is exercised in all kinds of ways by human beings every day. But when it's taken away, or the dominion of someone is suppressed, for instance, in slavery, as an example, it always goes badly because we're suppressing something that is God-given and creational about what a human being is and should be. And so there's always terrible consequences to doing that. And there are always slave revolts. It shouldn't surprise people who believe in dominion. But dominion is something that's tricky, though, obviously, because it's been affected by the fall. Dominion is this creational good thing, and yet it can be taken away from us by the domination of others, which is this sort of exaggerated dominion of taking too much control over other people. Or dominion can be lost or weakened by what I think of as abdicating responsibility. When I don't really want to take responsibility for anything around me, I sort of leave that to other people. Maybe I'm afraid of failure or whatever, but that's a kind of abdication of dominion that's actually a good thing that I'm supposed to exercise. That doesn't go well for people either. And so what Matthew Crawford is describing is like a little vision into a good aspect of what dominion could look like. But the problem is, and the history of work that he describes really bears out this, the ways in which dominion has been trampled on and messed up, and so our relationship to work has really suffered as a result. So God's reality, I think the way God has designed things and designed us, is always nudging us whether we realize it or not. And through both good and bad experiences in the world, we're being shown something about our own design. This is why the mechanics at the Ford factory walked out when they were told they had to, from now on, screw in one bolt over and over again. Right? There was something almost insulting about that to them, who were people who understood how a whole car worked, right, and had made them before. That reaction is in a sense a sign of the type of what a human being is, right? But also the good things, the joy that Matthew Crawford experiences when he successfully repairs a motorcycle and the owner revs the engine and tears out of the parking lot. This sort of exalted sense of accomplishment and agency in the world, which again, in a positive sense, is an indication of true dominion. So the closest that Matthew Crawford comes to naming the image of God is in this final quote. And I love it. And I just want him to come out and say that the image of God is a reality, but he doesn't. But he says this: thinking about manual engagement seems to require nothing less than that we consider what a human being is. That is, we are led to consider how the specifically human manner of being is lit up, as it were, by man's interaction with the world through his hands. For this, a new sort of anthropology is called for, one that is adequate to one that is adequate to our experience of agency. I would say it's not a new anthropology at all. Such an account might illuminate the appeal of manual work in a way that is neither romantic nor nostalgic, but rather simply gives credit to the practice of building things, fixing things, and routinely tending to things as an element of human flourishing. I mean, that to me could have come right out of Genesis 1. This is what it is to be put in the garden, to tend to it, to care for it, and to have dominion in it. So, reality is many people live very anxious and scattered and unsatisfying lives, which sometimes includes their work. And we all, I think, given that we live in, most of us live in modern America, are prone to the sort of narcissistic and magical thinking that Matthew Crawford describes. All of us, to some degree, are out of touch with reality with the result of the stuff around us. Given that this is the existence of many people, I think practices that involve significant mastery of physical things have the ability to ground us in really redemptive ways. So I think this is because they get us in touch with reality outside of our heads, like he keeps saying. And this inevitably undermines our narcissism when we are attempting to get in touch with reality outside of our heads. And it has the potential to really create a humility in us and an awareness of our dependence on God when we're constantly turning our attention outward from ourselves and our own mental state to real things and real people outside of ourselves. It's a wonderful professor of divinity at St. Andrews named Trevor Hart, who's done a lot of writing on the arts, and he writes about it, the accountability that Christian artists should have as they make their art. He's speaking about art, but it totally applies to any number of other endeavors in the world. So he says that Christian art making should include, I think I have this one, hopefully. Yeah. A respectful openness first to listen and learn from nature, to discover from it something of its prior orderliness. The artist may discover that true freedom is to be had by engaging in a creative dialogue with an artistry which both precedes and sets limits to its own. The artistic imagination ventures forth, as it were, into a world believed to be already rich with actual and potential meaning. There's a lot in that quote, and certainly a challenge to anybody who's in the arts, I think. But Trevor Hart's basically saying, because Christian artists, like all Christians, believe that the world has been created by God in all of its particularity, all the unique things that are in the world, they should expect to encounter both order and artistry when they set out to work. So part of being a Christian artist is to observe and to learn, to acknowledge, to some degree, submit to the ways that God has already ordered the world. We're not coming into a blank slate. We're not walking into absolute chaos. We're walking into a world in which there is a significant amount of order already established that had nothing to do with us. It was there before we got there. Ultimately, everybody has to submit to realities outside their heads. We're all going to die. If I jump in the air, I will hit the ground again. Reality isn't definable by me. But the Christian artist, says Trevor Hart, should expect and even enjoy the order that they find when they approach their work. It's not something to rebel against in the name of artistic freedom. It's something to revel in and then to work with, he says, in dialogue with prior orderliness. So what Matthew Crawford calls reality outside our heads, Trevor Hart calls prior orderliness established by God. In reality, they're talking about the same thing. Although I'm not sure Matthew Crawford knows that. But to master a material and produce anything good, there has to be a submission to external facts, the way things just are. And so If you're a sculptor that uses marble, in a sense, you're in the same boat as the electrician who's trying to wire a house and have it work. You're both submitting to things that are outside yourself, and if you're good and you actually really excel in what you're doing, there is you can't do that with at least some humility in you, because you've submitted to things that aren't you, realities that aren't you. So that's mostly what I have to say tonight. I think, just in conclusion, when we think about vocation and the vocations of our children, if we have children, we should try not to buy into the assumptions that Matthew Crawford identifies that are so prevalent in our culture about manual work. That it's automatically sort of it's a cognitively undemanding and sort of demeaning and of less value than white collar mental work in an office somewhere. There's no real biblical justification for that, and I'm conscious that I have not. I've been really wanting to sort of get across a lot of the thinking of Matthew Crawford in this lecture, and I haven't really put out a lot of biblical texts or talked about sort of the biblical foundation for this in any detail. I'm aware of that, but that's something that we can certainly talk about later. But working with your hands, I think, is a good and honorable way to serve God, and that's where I'm going to end. So what we do at L'Abri is have a time of conversation, time to ask questions, time to push back if you have issues with anything I've said. I'll do my best to interact with those questions, and we can go for a while. And I think there's the capability of typing in questions if you want to engage and you're not here in the room. And I think we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So, thank you.
Mic over here.
Any questions? Yeah.
Just like to add a little something to the book Farmer Boy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I think for farmers that then, as well as today, that have a self-sustaining type farm, I think you'd be hard pressed to find one then or now that's an atheist, that doesn't believe in God or a God just because they're so immersed in God's creation. And I think a farmer like that as well would probably enjoy greater like emotional and social stability as well too, just because they're so intertwined with their family members to help sustain the farm, as well as their neighbors. Like you can't really run a farm like that by yourself, and so you're very dependent on others, as well as compared to technology today, where we're largely autonomous in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just a greater like wholeness to a person spiritually, emotionally, and socially, working with their hands, especially digging into God's creation. It's the dirt and the soil as well.
So dependent in a more immediate way on things that are out of your control. Yeah. I mean, it has to be said also that, these kinds of small family farms that include a diversity of different things that are a large part, I think, of the past. Thankfully, there's still some, but the massive industrial farming is the model that's kind of taken over in much of this country, and it doesn't look much like Almanza's upbringing. But I think that's true, though. That I know that the very, very minor extent to which I've gardened or kept chickens or anything like that, you do get a sense of wonder that these things are kind of happening. You prepare something as best you can. You try to create the conditions for something to thrive, and then something has to happen that's really out of your control. And it should produce a sense of humility and dependence in us. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I want to sort of build on what Nate was talking about with Farmer Boy. You mentioned the part where Amonzo is looking forward to this breaking the cult, right? And that's sort of this like moment of like a big responsibility, like that he's going to take on. It's like obviously something that's difficult. Could you talk about that in relationship to like other sort of modern things that we see as like a moment of responsibility is like because I was thinking of like, okay, so like back then it was like breaking a colt, whereas like now maybe it's like I was just trying to think of like other sort of the like milestones of responsibility that like, you know, a teenage boy might take on, like or a teenager in general, not necessarily a boy, but and I mean some of them are obviously less elements of like you described, like sort of this manual competence. Maybe something like, you know, getting a cell phone, like obviously that's like something that is, it does take some responsibility, like you're not just going to give a cell phone to, you know, some irresponsible child, although plenty of people do that. But like that there is a level of responsibility that people see is like, okay, we're going to give you this thing, like be responsible with it. But yeah, I don't know. Could you comment on like we've almost replaced these milestones with like different things that do still require some responsibility, and obviously they're different, and yet there are some similarities. Could you comment at all?
That's a huge question. Anyone who wants to comment on that should feel free.
Can I give a funny and small example?
Please,
in Switzerland, we lived in Switzerland for a number of years. It's not quite the level of getting a horse, for sure. But if you're in the Swiss school system, when you're 10 or 11, you have to, they basically have a huge ceremony at school to give you a calligraphy pen. Each student, but you have to prove your handwriting is at a certain level, and then you get your special pen. And before that, you're only allowed to use pencil for everything. And then you get your like real ink pen, and that's what you're meant to use for many of the classes.
You're never allowed to make a mistake after that point.
And the teachers can actually take the pen back from you if your handwriting gets worse.
A shame.
It's a bit of a strange thing, but interesting as far as honoring the skill. With a real thing.
I think people have talked. I mean, I'm not sure of any resources in particular, but people have talked about the loss of rites of passage in our culture as being a really destructive thing for young people. In other words, there's not so many of the things that would have been kind of markers along the road towards adulthood are just not even a thing anymore. I mean, getting your driver's license would be a big one in terms of if you have access to a car, the freedom that comes with that. But you know, I've read kind of reflections on the way in which having a car is not. It doesn't signify like the kind of freedom that it might have done in the 1950s or 60s or 70s even today, because I think on average fewer people are excited to get their license and embrace that kind of responsibility and get in a car and drive off and do things, and people have talked a lot about how part of that is because you're engaging with your friends all the time, you know, in your room. Even though they're not there, you know, there's no sense that I have to like be free and get in a car and drive somewhere to have a social life. Although I would say like to have a real social life, you do still. And so, I mean, I know lots of people that are more than old enough to drive a car and could, but never really wanted to. And rely on their siblings to drive them around places. not that everybody has to have a car, of course not. But there's something going on there in terms of the at least in some cases what I would call the abdication of dominion. So I would rather just coast right here. Thank you very much. Than take on a new responsibility and challenge, even if it will have lots of positive things it allows me to do. It's an unknown. I'd rather just not. Other rites of passage.
You know, they kind of only have been retained like in religious spheres. So like confirmation or a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah. Like, And I suppose for a bar mitzvah, I think you have to recite so much of the Torah. So that's sort of a skill. That's kind of an academic skill. But yeah, they're.
Well, those are more like formalized rites of passage, right? But I would say that there are probably like some that are like more sort of informalized rites of passage.
That you wouldn't think to call rites of passage, but still kind of function in that way.
Yeah.
Can you have ideas?
I mean, I know people were laughing at like getting a cell phone, but like I would say that is like in some like maybe not now. I don't know like what age kids are on average getting a cell phone now, but like when I turned 16, it was like you can get a cell phone, or like we're gonna give you a cell phone now. And it's like okay, now there is like this thing that's opened up, and like you can now communicate with the outside world, right? And like so in a way that's like a modern rite of passage. Whether that's good or bad, or we can talk about that too. But I mean, I think things like getting your license, or things like that, like getting your license is a rite of passage, like regardless of whether you have a car or not, but like that is in a way a rite of passage. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways it is kind of getting access to something bigger, like going to college is a rite of passage in a way, or like getting your first job or your first paycheck is a rite of passage. So I mean, these are all sort of like cultural, in a lot of ways those are like more technological or economic rites of passage rather than like religious or like social rites of passage.
But they're significant. I mean,
for sure.
Interesting conversation we've had sometimes at L'Abri is just, what does it mean to be an adult? Like, what does adulthood mean to all of you? What is it? What do you have to have in place to be an adult? And is the concept attractive?
Or even like all the articles written about like #adulting, like because maybe there's like some nostalgia for like skills you actually haven't developed until you're like early 20s or mid 20s, and so you're like, oh no, now I don't know how to like pay my bills or whatever it is that you haven't figured out.
That's the thing with a cell phone too. It's not just like getting a phone. It's like, when do you get of the age where you pay for your phone as well, when you're responsible for your data plan and all of that, because it does. And no shame on anyone, but like we for a while were, there's no Wi-Fi in the house here, and wanting to limit use, but more and more people come at very young age. They don't have a job, and they have this massive data plan, so they can just watch Netflix anytime, anywhere. And I don't know, there's a part of me where maybe it is sort of a step, some sort of acknowledgement of coming older, but it still prolongs. There's no responsibility tied to it. There's
and that's the thing that I think is the redemptive thing about rites of passage, is that it comes with a new respect and status and freedoms, but it's always with responsibilities that you've taken on in order to stand in that place. Certainly in Farmer Boy, it's like, okay, you were able to do this now, so you can. One example real quick is this guy, I knew a guy, he actually used to work here. I hope I'm getting the story right. Unbelievably gifted guy, could fix his car and do anything he put his mind to. In any case, when he was young, I think it was like a teenager, he had an older brother, and his dad dismantled this old Volvo. I mean, I wasn't there, I don't know how dismantled it was, but like broke it down significantly, spread it all out on the lawn, and told his kids they had to drive it off the lawn. And they did. they figured out how to, and I'm sure he was there to help them, but and I think they'd already done some mechanical work before, but they basically reassembled the whole car and drove it off. And I'm not sure whether there was like, okay, now you have this car. That would be awesome. I'm not sure that was it. Yeah. Anna,
there's a question from Andrew Chapman in Alaska.
No way!
Yeah, he said he really enjoyed the lecture.
Oh.
He listened while doing a bit of creating, in this case trimming out some doors. You talked about the resurgence of analog. Do you think we are also entering a modern resurgence of labor/trades/craftsmanship?
Yes.
I think it depends who you talk to. It depends where you are. I think there are I'm not sure whether there's a resurgence that's widespread, but there's definitely pockets of resurgence among people who really value that, and in some place, depending where you are in the country, there's some places where that's economically viable. To do for work. I'm just thinking of for a long time, to be a furniture maker and to make nice handmade furniture was just synonymous with starving, because who's going to spend that amount of money for something that's handmade, given the time and the energy you put into it, and you have to charge an outrageous amount for nice handmade furniture, right? And there's this really interesting book by a guy named Peter Korn, Why We Make Things and Why It Matters, and it's all about him as a furniture maker, his obsession with making furniture, and just talks a bit about the how unrealistic economically it is to do that. But there are, and I'm thankful I've seen some of this among Christian communities, a commitment to support people who are making good things, both locally, but also certainly there's aspects of that within farming and food, just trying to being much more intentional about what we buy and trying to support people who we know are really doing something ethical and good. Other people could probably speak to this more than me. But like, there's a good thing about buying something handmade, right? I think there's something that appeals to lots of us.
But also there's been a huge uptick in attention given to vocational high schools, whereas 10 or 15 years, that's where sort of you went if you were a dropout. But now there's quite an appeal for kids to get into vocational skills schools. And there's wait lists now. Yeah, they're really good schools. And you have to go with letters of recommendation. And I do think that there is attention both to, I think, the things that I have read, just that the connection between depression and not working with your hands and the high rate of suicide, of meaningless work. And then the connection of people who work with their hands actually are much more happy. They can quantify that and however you want to say happy, but are much more proud of the work that they do, because there's a mark of achievement. Like, I have grown this much, instead of just like sales or whatever. But I do think that vocational skill schools are growing, and definitely in New England. I mean, there's quite a lot of vocational skills schools that have been given lots of attention.
Yeah, I think it's important too, along those lines, just that the fact that there's starting to be more equal opportunity to work with your hands, which is exciting. I think, because something that I was thinking about a lot during the lecture and struggling with a little bit is just this sort of cultural connection between manual labor and our enforcement of gender roles. And even in the shop class book, all his pronouns were male, and I mean, understandably, the image that comes to probably all of our minds is male when we think of manual labor. I think the example of your grandmother was really cool. But just like I was thinking about, like, to what extent is manual labor like a result of necessary gender roles? To what extent does it enforce harmful gender roles? I've seen it to be harmful to men sometimes, in that if that's not how you're inclined, you're less masculine, you're less valuable.
You don't like to work in your car, you're somehow less of a man.
Right, exactly. But I think on the other side of that, seeing space for women to make things, not only in the home but as work, is really exciting.
Kelly, can I invoke your name for a minute? This is just for those of you who are not present in the room. Our wonderful helper at Kelly is a butcher and researched local farms around here, and we were able to go and pick up a hog the other day, which is, it's been on my mind a lot in the last few days. All of our minds, I feel like. But Kelly found a farm that's owned and run by women, and it's an admirable place in some ways because they actually slaughter the pigs there where they are grown. So there's you avoid the whole sort of traumatic transport of the animal to a slaughterhouse and all that. And Kelly basically butchered this pig and broke it down and was gracious enough to allow us to sort of help her in that process. And I just found the timing of this leading up to that lecture was really a joy to me to see like manual competence and manual competence that's actually like a potential real way of life, a good vocation, and that so obviously serves and helps people. And I haven't heard the term whole animal butchery before, but like using every aspect of this animal, like to throwing away very, very little. It's been really, really eye-opening and wonderful. So this has been a nice example of both the importance of manual competence, but also a typical gender role being upset here. Because I mean, Kelly, I'm sorry, I'm talking for you, Kelly.
Oh, you're fine.
Yeah, not an ordinary thing for a woman to work in a butcher shop, but we've benefited from it a lot. So that's been really, really a fun thing in the last few days, and that's going to be really yummy.
Yeah, but your description of your grandparents, that's my parents.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my dad. He doesn't know how to work the remote, but my mom, she could fix anything.
Yeah.
She worked with wood. If something was broken, she could figure out a way to fix it. But yeah, going back to Andrew's question, I think this is, because I remember reading this book. I don't know if I finished it, the one Shot Glass Soul Crap.
I quoted most of it tonight, so you can say you finished it.
Good refresher, but I think he was talking about, and we've kind of alluded to tonight, but a lot of jobs are getting outsourced.
Yeah.
Information kind of jobs, and a lot of jobs are going to be replaced with automation, but there's a lot of jobs that just can't be outsourced or replaced, and those are the trades. You can't outsource a plumber. Or, a machine can't come in and fix that for you. So I wonder if that's going to cause more people to go there, and the trade schools are going to just be more desirable, because it's like, well, I know job security is there,
be work,
and there's always going to be that as the population goes up.
Yeah. He talks about that a fair amount in
Yeah, I remember him saying, like, even if say you're never going to be a plumber, well, you know what? It could be good. Like, if that's not going to be the job you want for the rest of your life, it's good to have a skill like that in case times get tough, or you need a part-time job on the side. And I just thought, oh man, that's good advice, I think, for young people to hear.
Yeah. He said he has some cheeky remark in there about, I forget the exact wording, but like you can buy lots of things from China, but when your motorcycle breaks down, the Chinese can't help you. Yeah, because they're in China. What are you gonna do? There's and he's just making that same point. Like there's a lot of work that's impossible to outsource, so it never will be, and there's always gonna be demand for it, and it makes no sense to sort of denigrate that work as somehow low and menial at all. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, this is kind of like a different viewpoint from it, but you're talking about art, and this summer, it was like super random how it came about, but I learned that I could actually draw, and I was kind of like shocked, and I was like, I have no clue why, and like, I wanted to hear your perspective, because it's kind of been something I've been like struggling with to try to understand, okay, why do I now have this random gift? And would you argue, oh, it's something like this, where you're doing it with your hands, and thus it's like combating that kind of trend of technology, or what would your perspective be on it? Because you're creating something, but it's in a different sense of creating something
Sure.
that people use. It's more
Sure.
like a personal thing.
Well, I guess the easy answer is to say I don't know why and how this came about in your life, because I don't know you. I only met you a few minutes ago. But I could imagine it's
or just in general,
Yeah.
like why
Yeah.
God gives like gifts like that. That might be.
yeah,
He likes them.
because he likes them.
Because I'm like, what's the purpose?
Maybe he thought you would like it.
I do. I do, but okay.
Well, I mean, it is. The thing I like about this whole conversation is it levels the playing field in terms of the types of things. We talk about manual competence, the ability to do things with your hand. It can be plumbing, it can be car mechanics, it can be, in other words, the trades or crafts, but it also can be fine art. It's all, those things are different from each other, but they all involve some sort of ability to manipulate things effectively with your hands. And so in one sense, learning how to draw is totally manual competence, although it's not in the same sense that learning how to fix a broken appliance is. It has more to do with the imagination and seeing differently and learning how to see and translate what you see through your brain to your hands and actually produce something that's, so there's it's different but alike, I guess. Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
I'd like to talk to you about that more, but I don't know. Yeah, Roger.
Really fast, Ellie, there's a term for what you were trying to talk about, and it's called manual labor. And
did you just make that up, or is that for real?
It's the term
It's
we
both.
always use it.
But if you ever make an all-woman punk band, that'd be really cool if you called it that. But so going back to what you mentioned, like partway through the lecture, you're talking about it was a quote from Soulcraft about how so many just like everyday appliances are made so it's impossible for, even if you wanted to work on yourself, it's literally impossible to, because you can't replace one part, or the screws like some crazy star shape or something like that. And so I think that if having a more hands-on analog approach to every aspect of our lives, that's like to become more normal, it might have to become like pretty widespread, like a big demand for like industries to change that, because my dad, who's been working on cars forever, he says like, I can't work on cars made in 2020 because so much of it is there's so much like computerized stuff, unless you're actually in a shop with equipment that's like thousands of dollars.
The computers you need to test the computers that are in the car.
And like you can't, you literally can't do anything. So I think that's going to be like, it's going to be like a big cultural demand to be like, we want to be able to do this ourselves.
It's a wet blanket on the whole tradition of tinkering, like just being able to mess around with your car in the garage. It's like, he talks about this a lot, like this the aesthetic of streamlined. It goes along with the magical thinking kind of thing. It's just like you can't see anything of the workings of something, and it's supposed to be just intuitive and to respond to your desires, and he says, like, if you open the hood of like a modern Mercedes or whatever, there's essentially another hood underneath it. You can't see anything in there. He gripes about at one point about I don't know what he has against Mercedes, but he's like in new Mercedes, they don't even have a dipstick. You can't even check the oil in it. You just get a light on your dashboard saying maintenance required, which is just a meaningless statement. He's basically saying the responsibility for your oil level has been taken away from you, and from whose responsibility is it anymore?
Well,
like it gets. Like, you have to go to a mechanic and say something's wrong.
Like they're setting you up to be incompetent.
Exactly.
And my dad does it because he's not about to pay money to go to a mechanic. So that's I joke about that, but it's like a huge that's a real thing. It's like, that's like, you could be saving yourself so much time and hassle and, you know, money by knowing how to do it yourself. But it's like, intentional or not, or like, it's like, you're stopped from doing that. And so I think unless that's like a wide cultural demand, it's going to be really hard for like individuals to be like, I know how to fix my car.
There'll be a bigger and bigger market for old cars.
Well, it's also one of the reasons I think some people get into motorcycles is because there's actually an engine. It's not covered by a computer panel. I mean, maybe brand new motorcycles are. I don't know, but this is how my dad talks about motorcycles. That it actually, you can actually interact with an engine like you used to be able to in a car. And that's why a lot of people get into them. I mean, maybe they enjoy riding a motorcycle too, but they have access to what we no longer have access to when it comes to cars. When my boys were really young, I had
before
this,
they were long, actually.
I had this longing to figure out car engines. I don't know why. It was brief. But I just thought, this would be so cool. I have these relatives who understand engines. I don't understand anything at all about them. So I went to my granddaddy at the time, and I knew he knew a ton about engines, did a lot of tinkering, and he basically wouldn't even talk to me about it because he was like, there's no point in you learning any of this because it's all computerized now, and it's only going to get more and more computerized. Like you said, there's another hood. It's like you open a car hood and there's just, it's a computer. You can't even get down to the things that I could teach you about anymore. And it was so sad.
So depressing,
all this, I mean, what is basically turned into now, you know, people have small engine knowledge, like motorcycles and other things like that. You know, lawnmowers and whatnot. But it was just a really sad moment in realizing what has been lost in fixing up cars yourself.
And it's kind of like what you said about, I think it was in the book, of how technology is making us feel like we're independent, but we're actually dependent on it. And it seems like it's like that for all different things, of like deceiving us of like, oh, you're independent, you can drive this car, you get access to all these things, but then it's like a fake curtain, and actually we can't.
He says, this is a fascinating passage in there, and one of the things I didn't quote from the book is he's saying autonomy versus agency. It's two different things. Like, autonomy is this sort of illusion that we have from our technology, that we can go out and just achieve anything, and everything is so streamlined and intuitive, and we never, it just, you know, you can think something, desire something, and have it, and whatever. There's a sense of autonomy, which is not at all the same thing as agency, which is what he actually is in favor of, which is like actually knowing how things work. And there's sort of a digital shell over the mechanical realities of our stuff. The digital shell makes it all seem intuitive and smooth, and yet we don't really understand what's going on. We don't have any way of coping when the digital fails. So he's talking about agency and then a certain kind of autonomy, which is really an illusion.
Digital shell is kind of like a scary image for all of life right now. Just an engine.
Well, I think there's hope for just, you know, we just have to be open to buying beat up old cars that we can still work on. I don't know.
And I mean, like, your faucets still work pretty similarly than what they did, you know, a few decades ago. So it's like, I mean, I guess the car is just one example. But there's plenty of other stuff you can.
Just some things that don't change much. That's true.
There's also so many things that are, like, I'll go to my grandmother's house and use her blender, and it's like, you know, from the 50s, and I'm like, this is so much better at blending things.
It wasn't made to break immediately after the warranty ran out.
There's one more comment on Facebook.
Okay.
Someone's just mentioning a place on Martha's Vineyard. It's a boat shop, by Gannon and Benjamin, master craftsmen of traditional wooden sailboats. And he's saying just a ton of people come to this shop. It's casually open to the public, and it's a beautiful example of this, skilled work with one's hands.
Yeah, awesome. Oh, I would love to go see it. The is it North Bennett Street School is a really amazing sort of prestigious school in Boston, which is it has very specific programs. It has like a violin making program. It has a cabinetry program, bookbinding program.
Jewelry.
There's and so but it's all very, very specific, high end, like excellent training in all these different areas. And it's very inspiring to go. We went on a like an open house tour of it once.
But the average age of their students is like 48.
Wow. Yeah, and a lot of it's like business people that are fed up and wanted to learn a manual skill. Yeah, actually, one of the guys I know was a lawyer. I knew him through playing Irish music. He was a lawyer for years, and he was like 60, and he's like, screw this. And he went and learned how to make violins, and it was amazing. Yeah, but you can see the appeal of that. Yeah, Sarah.
I have a lot of scattered thoughts, but one of my concerns is, or I think there's a right concern to say it's good that there's a resurgence of training for trades, or that you want job security, this is the direction you should go, But my concern is that we tie the work of our hands to let me make sure I can make a paycheck, out of this, and even to think if I can make something, I should sell it,
Right. Yeah.
Which maybe, but I think that's. The other thing I'm thinking about is my dad is a furniture maker and has sort of miraculously stayed in business against all odds for decades now. But it's actually all of the California hoops of what is required of small businesses that is the greatest threat to his existence. So he's profoundly gifted in his work. There's definitely people that want to buy his stuff, but to be able to be in business is just this whole other thing that has nothing to do with being competent in a trade or a skill,
or the demand for what you're making.
And so I don't know. There's that piece that I'm sort of puzzling over. I don't want to downplay the difficulty of that aspect of it, and even I just wonder how much our sort of our standard of living gets in the way of pursuing some of these things, because we don't really want a pioneer life. And I don't think most people want the life of an entrepreneur, who, or maybe somebody in the tech world who's an entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur who's trying to
small business
entrepreneur, that kind of just what I've seen in my family, there weren't vacations, life is work. It makes me think of the picture you get of a restaurant family. It's you live at the restaurant, life is the restaurant, and so I wonder too, how, I think that can be a wonderful and beautiful thing, but I just wonder how much we don't want. We don't want just that. We want all of these things, which I think, I don't know, kind of, the other thought I was intrigued by was that we are more interested in potential than achievement. We don't want the restaurant life. We want to have a little bit of all of these things. Or I want the freedom to learn how to make violins because I have the 401k of a lawyer.
Right.
But anyway, I'm sort of rambling here, but I think my main concern is just we should explore the work of our hands and put our hands to all sorts of good work, whether or not we can sell it.
Sure.
Well, maybe I'll answer and then respond.
But there's a lot there that's really interesting and helpful, I think, because it's I hear in your comments a reminder of just the danger of romanticizing something, I think, and celebrating potential rather than actual. There's it's easy for people to romanticize sort of this kind of work who don't have to depend on this kind of work to actually survive. And so that's certainly a danger. And something to just be very aware of.
I think I'm thinking of parallels in the humanities too, where it's like you don't major in English because you think you're going to make money on it. And there's so many worthy pursuits. So many worthy pursuits. Anyway, I'm sort of chasing some of this down the path of like vocational discernment, I guess. And,
he has some good thought. I mean, he, meaning Matthew Crawford, has some interesting thoughts on, because you have the idea of working for a paycheck. There's intrinsic and extrinsic rewards for work, and he talked about with the advent of, I mean, obviously the work has always, to some degree, for some people, been drudgery ever since the fall, but he talks about this idea of talking of our paycheck as compensation for the work you're doing is just a very sort of a depressing idea. Like, it's truly compensation when the work itself, there's no intrinsic joy to doing the work itself. It's just like, oh my gosh, at least I'll get paid on Friday. And obviously that's toxic and sad, and the position that maybe most people are in. And so we don't want to forget that. But at the same time, you don't have to say that if I'm getting paid for this, therefore there's no intrinsic value to this, because you can certainly enjoy and find fulfillment out of something you're making, even though you're getting paid for it. Although you hear stories of like hobbies that turn into jobs, and people kind of it's just not as fun anymore. But I don't think the two are intrinsically at odds with each other. I think there could be. I mean, I assume your dad is an example of that. I mean, he obviously makes furniture in order to support his family and to have his home, but he wouldn't do it if he didn't love making furniture. And there's some intrinsic reward to that that's not just the money, right?
And that there's a way of life that is provided that isn't just financial.
Josh, read this.
I just a couple sort of scattered thoughts or comments, but piggybacking off of your getting to know your dad over the years. One of the things that I think sometimes draws people into manual work, and whether that's any sort of creative act with their hands, or we mentioned earlier farming and stuff, is becoming aware of what we've done to the earth, and on this like massive scale, and how the Industrial Revolution has just led to so much pollution. And but one of your dad's biggest burdens has been environmental regulations, because they change so fast and so rapidly that some of the equipment he has, or some of the stains he uses on furniture, he will get fined. Like, he'll buy it and then he can't even finish using it before it's no longer. It's like not up to code. It's like illegal to use, and it's made him quite cynical, if not outright antagonistic, to the environment, any sort of environmental movement, because it's sinking his. It's been very difficult for him.
Oh.
And
sad.
Yeah,
and then
I'm just like, he's a one-man band.
Yeah, good things at odds with each other.
It's not like pollution is going into a river somewhere. Like that. Like that's what's lamentable. I think.
Because it's legislation that's designed to rein in like big industry.
Yeah.
And he's like this
small-time
furniture maker getting slammed.
Yeah.
And it just even sort of parallel to that, like our, including my need for gasoline and our cultural's need for that, which is driven by cars, has not been a good thing. It has led our country into wars. It's caused untold problems, and I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but there is to me something exciting about more energy efficient technologies that come via screen underneath all those things. And I'm not naive enough to think that Elon Musk and Tesla are really driven by the nobleness that they sometimes wear, but I do think there are some potential exciting things moving in, that digital or computers can allow. I don't think that is characteristic or necessary. I think most large technology firms are fairly duplicitous about, fairly two-faced about all of this stuff and create an outrageous amount of waste. But I just wonder if there could be some good, or I don't know. Maybe we should all just go back to trains. I feel like trains are where it's at.
So you're talking about the concern for just decreasing fossil fuel usage and sort of the car industry turning more and more towards electric cars. Good thing for the environment, and yet for this whole question that we were talking about earlier about learning how to work with your cars, those seem to be at odds. Or would require a degree to be able to do anything to it.
I don't really. Was just thoughts.
That's a good point.
Spinning off of listening to your dad's frustrations.
Early California.
Kelly.
I think that's like when I was talking to all the farmers I talked to last year for my master's, they I was asking a lot of them about okay, well, how do you feel about all of the environmental regulations that are going on? And they were like, well, we think this is okay, for the most part, the farmers were like, we're farmers. We want the earth to be living, otherwise we wouldn't have a livelihood.
Right.
Our problem is when there's a disconnect between our way of life and the people in the city who are making the laws they've never worked with their hands in their entire life. And I think that there are wonderful things that are saving, that are trying to work with the environment and work with technology, and we need that because we can't go back because we aren't like we used to be. But with the people who are still doing those practical hands-on jobs, there needs to be this whether it's rural and urban working together or hands and brain working together. We aren't a disconnected. We are a whole body.
Incoherent.
And so I think that's where we get in trouble. And I mean, I tend to romanticize. I would love to go back to an agrarian society, but that wouldn't be perfect at all.
Yeah, in the other Little House books, this is the one where there's always enough to eat, and it's not Laura's own life. She often they're really living on the edge a lot of the time.
Very. I mean, Almanzo's story growing up is on an established, very prosperous farm, and his dad is a successful farmer and has people working for him. Whereas Laura's experience is a dad that wants to go somewhere new every couple of years, so they're just and they're really the long winter is the pretty terrifying story. That's very true. Yeah, the long winter, reading The Long Winter doesn't allow you to romanticize sort of the pioneer life. It's good. It takes the wind out of your sails. Anybody else? Maybe we'll wrap it up. Thank you. Everything seemed to work all right?
I think so.
Yeah, it was great.
Oh, good.
It was all really clear and.
Thanks for working out the bugs over the last few lectures, guys.
Yeah.
I watched it.
Best one yet.